Hi, I'm Debbie Brown, and this week I'm going to show you another way to quilt a crate quilt for a shelter animal in need. As a reminder, the crate quilts are 14 by 20 inches, and they're made from 2.5-inch squares, which would be 10 squares across, 7 squares down. For the video, I'm using squares in 2 different shades of gray so that you can see how I use the seams instead of marking my quilt. But I'm also raiding my stash, and I'm using up a lot of my 2.5-inch strips and squares to make more quilts for the shelter animals. This week I'm going to be using a thread called Paradise, and it is a beautiful purple and lime green and an orangey yellow. It's just a really bright, happy thread. That is from Fabulux, from Wonderfill, and it is a 40 weight 3-ply polyester, so it's really going to shine and show you the color. But I don't use that in the bobbin. What I'm going to use in the bobbin is called Deco Bob, and that is an 80 weight polyester thread. So it's really thin, will make a really nice stitch on the back of the quilt, and I won't have to change the bobbin while I'm quilting. That's a win. The color I'm using here is called Soft Gold. It's one that I use all the time. It's one of my favorite colors of Deco Bob. To quilt this crate quilt, I'm using the walking foot on my machine. I have a 1/2-inch mark and a 1/4-inch mark on my walking foot, and this week I'm going to use the 1/4-inch mark. I have my quilt layered together. I have some plain cotton on the back. I have Quilter's Dream green batting inside, and if you are paying careful attention, you can see that it's been stitched together. I used my leftover batting pieces, and I stitched them together with the Deco Bob, which is a very thin thread, so that you can't feel it through the quilt. I don't think the shelter animals will be very critical if they can say, "Hey Debbie, I noticed that there's a seam in your batting." They're going to be a really friendly audience. But I know on quilts that I'm making that are gifts for people or for show or samples, I don't want people to be able to tell there's a seam in the batting. So if you look carefully, you can see it, but you can't feel it. And then I have my pieced fabric on the top. I have this laid out with the 10 squares going left to right in my sewing machine. I've got plenty of room for this. If you have a smaller machine, you may need to roll your quilt up slightly because this is a Handy Quilter Stitch 710. It has a nice, generous throat opening, but some of my smaller machines don't have as big of an opening. So here I can put it all out, and I'm going to start stitching in the batting, and I'm going to start stitching 1/4 inch inside the seam that is right in the middle of my quilt. I'm going to start stitching in the batting so that I don't have to worry about knots. All the knots and cuts are going to be in the batting, so I don't have any starts and stops in the middle of my quilt, which is fabulous. So I'm going to stitch down 5 squares. And when I get to the end of my 5th square, I'm not going to stitch all the way to the seam. I'm going to stitch within 1/4 inch of the seam inside, and then with my needle down, I'm going to pick up the foot, rotate my quilt, and stitch 5 squares going down. So I'm making this kind of offset and angular, and it's going to be a big V or a big L going across my quilt. So when I finish stitching off the edge of my quilt, I'm going to press the scissors button on my machine. Don't have to worry about it because it's in the binding area of the quilt. The knot is not in the quilt at all. So I am going to move my quilt, and I'm now going to stitch on the other side of that seam line. Can you see how bright and cheerful that thread looks on there? And now I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch past the seam. With the needle down, turn it, so I can finish stitching, cut my thread, and start again. So I have this big L here, and I'm going to continue stitching on either side of my seam line, going in 4 squares, 3 squares, 2 square, 1 square. And when I'm done with that, I will continue working upside down, but I'll be back to show you that. Now that I've finished stitching from those 5 squares, that making big L's going all the way to the corner of my quilt, I can continue working those L's out. But the quilt is getting pushed further and further into the machine, and that's not really comfortable or practical if it's a larger quilt. I use these crate quilts as a great way to practice a technique and give me confidence so that I can go take this on a larger project. A baby quilt or a gift quilt, a throw for the sofa. You know, start with something really small like this, lets you work out the pattern and get comfortable. But as we're working on something little, I want you to keep in mind what it would be like on a larger quilt. So what I'm going to do is turn my quilt upside down. And I'm going to start working these in the opposite direction, keeping most of the quilt outside of my machine. So I'm going to make this big L, a 1/4 of an inch in. And again, I'm going to stop 1/4 of an inch inside of my seam. If you don't have a marking on your foot to see where that 1/4 inch is, or if you can't judge that by eyeballing it, you can mark it ahead of time so that you know where to stop. Turn the quilt. And stitch all the way down. Let's do one more row here. So what do I do now that I've finished stitching? I'm out. I have no more blocks in this direction. What I'm going to do is just stitch vertical lines on either side of each seam for the rest of the quilt. The L would be cut off here. So I'm going to finish stitching that and I'll be back to show you when it's done. Now I've finished stitching all of my lines, and you can see how it's an offset L going through my quilt with some straight lines on the side. It gives it a non-traditional look, and I think it would also look great on a baby quilt. Doesn't that look great? I plan on using this offset pattern time and time again on other charity quilts, giveaway quilts, baby quilts. But I hope you take the time to practice this style of quilting on something small, like a crate quilt for a shelter animal, placemats, baby quilts. Watching machine quilting videos is great, and I appreciate the time that you watch my videos, but nothing will replace practice. You won't get confident as a machine quilter until you actually practice on fabric. So I hope you take the time to practice this tutorial. If you want to see more videos, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Head on over to debbiebrownquilts.com and sign up for my newsletter, or purchase some supplies that I used in today's video. I'll be back soon with another video. Happy quilting!